Good morning. As I said this earlier today and during the class time, it really is an honor to be with you all today. My name is Sam Garner. This is my wife Rachel. I work at York College over in York, Nebraska. We are both relatively new to Nebraska, so it's really been a joy to be able to visit at some of the churches around the state over the last few years. And we are grateful to join you today. It dawned on me this morning when I introduced Rachel before class began. I guess it's appropriate now that I begin to also introduce, we are actually matched in Bulgaria and Eastern Europe. We're waiting for a sibling pair. So probably in the next couple of years we'll be bringing home a couple kids, both under the age of 5. So I guess that's something I should announce now. And well, thank you. We've been registered since about May, so that is something that's changing our life in ways that we can't predict right now, but has made a difference already. So just wanted to share that. But it is grateful to be with you and to join you this morning. I want to look in Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 38. Mark chapter 12. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Let's pray. Our God, again, we are thankful for this day that you have blessed us with. You are the one who gives us the days of our lives. And as we watch the destruction around us at times, we are grateful. We feel blessed to have opportunities to serve you. Father, this morning as we hear this text, as we hear the description from your Son, Jesus, I pray that our hearts would be open, that we would be prepared to hear what you have to teach us through it. That there is a way of life that looks much more like this poor widow than the scribes who sometimes walk around us. God, make us like her. Give us the ability to see the world as she does, and call us to be more like you. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. I don't think it's any accident that Mark puts these stories together. Could have been other things that happened from the time Jesus had a few things to say to when he went to the treasury. But Mark wants us to see, I believe, these 2 stories aligned. He does this frequently. All the gospel writers do it, but Mark really likes to put 2 stories together that call us to attention to notice what's different between sets of people. How we ought to be compared to how we are. And so he opens up with a description of the scribes. He sees a group of people that are important. They're important in the political society. They're important in the religious society. Notice that Jesus says, watch the way they like to walk around in their long robes and get looked at. They wear the uniform and they're proud to wear it. These are people that it's kind of hard for us to describe who they are, but it's almost like the perfect combination of a theologian and a lawyer. I know a lot of theologians, I know a lot of lawyers. I don't know that I'd want to be compared to either one at certain times. But that's what Jesus calls us to attention to see. These scribes. These people who garner all sorts of attention for who they are, what they know, what they understand. And people look to them for wisdom. They want to hear from them. They want to understand what it looks like to follow God most closely. These are the people who hold Torah, who hold the law, and who are able to share, many times in positive ways, what it looks like to be a follower of God. These are people who are at their best, point the way to a life that looks different than the world around them. They play an important role. These are not people that should always be ostracized. But what Jesus has begun to see, and that's probably been happening for far too long, is there are a group of scribes who have taken it upon themselves just to be important for the sake of being important. And they've prided themselves on who they are and not the way that they are behaving. And so Jesus points out an indictment. He says, these are the people who are devouring widows' houses. And if you are a Jew around the time of Jesus, or if you're a Jew at all at any time, you know that the law constantly speaks of the way that we treat those who are most dependent on others. Right? The widows and the orphans. Those two groups get mentioned over and over again. And God really believes strongly in the fact that how we treat those who are dependent upon others says a lot about who we are. And a lot of times we can take kind of an inventory of our life and the way that we behave and the way that we treat others and the way that we treat those who are at the mercy, who don't have resources, who don't have power, who don't have the ability many times to take care of themselves. God calls us to take inventory of that. How do you treat them? And Jesus tosses this very heavy indictment against the scribes, some of the scribes. And He says, you have treated the widows in ways that's destroying them. It's not supporting them. It's not encouraging them. It's not holding them up for the wisdom they have to offer, but it's taking advantage of them. And He says, when you do that, you're in the wrong. You're behaving in ways that do not honor who I am and do not honor the role that you've been called to perform in. And Jesus calls the scribes to something so much more important. He even says it. He says they're going to face very harsh indictments because of the way they act, because they know better. They know who they're supposed to be. They know what they ought to be like. But for Jesus, this is the scribes versus another person. He sits across and watches the treasury. Our assumption here is this is the great temple of Jerusalem. This is the central location of faith for so many God-fearers and God-believers. This is the place that has such dominating importance in the history of who they are. This is the place that matters above all other places because this is the place where God dwells. And people are giving money to support the temple. They're giving money to support the ministry that takes place there. And Jesus sees this woman, this widow, this lady who takes out 2 copper coins, probably worth less than a penny nowadays, and places it in. All that she has, and she gives it. He doesn't give a description of what she's thinking or what the process of thought is going through, but you almost get the impression here that this is nothing new for her. Because it tends to be true that if we're willing to give all we have, we're almost always willing to give all we have. It takes a life of cultivating that kind of practice for us to do those sorts of things. Not all of us end up like Scrooge. A momentary change all of a sudden where we start giving everything we have when we gave nothing before. And Jesus watches this lady do this very act. And He notices the difference. The scribes, who are important, who have power, and who have many times taken that power and abused it. Abused it against the very kind of people that Jesus is now pointing to in the treasury and says, do you notice this lady and the way she gives all that she has? This kind of impression that Jesus gives here is that He sees both groups of people, the scribes and the lady, the widow, and He sees them all as being religious. He doesn't deny that any of them don't believe in God. He doesn't call them out for not being true people of faith. But what He does have to say is that their practices in faith are so varying different. They just set up 2 different types of people. And Jesus says, you need to be more like one than the other. But the thing with the scribes is I have to admit, sometimes when we think in terms of religious people that matter, this is what our world looks to. People that wear the right clothing, right? People that put on the right persona. People that demonstrate themselves to be of a certain mind and thought and that have everything put together and that operate with such wonderful adoration in the community around them, at least in the community of faith. And then he opposes that with this woman who doesn't have much at all, who has no power to speak of. But Jesus says she's the one that is more impressive. And the more I think about that, the more that really does amaze me. Because she doesn't look the part, at least how I see it. She doesn't come across as somebody that you're going to notice in a crowd and say, tell me what you think, show me what you have, point me towards the way I need to go. No, it's those other types of people. It's those ones that have a name, those that really have some kind of a sense of being in the culture at large. Those are the ones that normally we're going to look to, not the poor widow. Not the one who doesn't exude any kind of influence or any kind of difference-making in society. But Jesus points us in a different direction. The separation that he makes, the way that he speaks of these two different types of people, it's harsh. He saves no words to declare how badly he thinks of the people who take advantage. And he also saves no words to talk about what he sees, the humble servant who walks in and gives all that she has. But many times what God does and what Jesus does in his ministry, he flips everything over that we believe. He says, what you've thought all along about how things work and the way things are, it's not really that way. Everything's a little different. Because the woman, the widow, is the one you should emulate, not the one with power. I finished my schooling in Texas. The last year that I was in West Texas, in Abilene, and the last year I was there, I just got married to Rachel, and she had moved from where she was going to grad school in Ohio, and we lived that last year together because I had an extra year to do beyond what she had to. And so we're living there in Abilene, and towards the end of the year I began to look for a job because schooling was over and it was time to move and actually get a full-time job. And so we're looking all around the country, making trips, and just kind of nothing. The right fit never came along. And one of my teachers called me and said, we've got a little congregation. It's about an hour and a half outside of Abilene and kind of the middle of West Texas. And they need someone to come out and preach. And would you be willing to just go out there every Sunday, preach and teach, and do some other things for them until it's time for you to go? And I said, sure. And come to find out more of the story, it was a little more. It was a congregation of about 15, 25, maybe 30 people. And they had just fired their minister of 40 years. He was in his mid-80s. His health had gotten to the point where they were scared about him driving to church every Sunday. And so what do you do when you have a wise, older guy that's in his mid-80s, that's been around ministry? You hire a 25-year-old who has no experience and doesn't really know much at all. So they asked us to come out. We remember the first Sunday that we pulled up, this little church building. It was in a town that had been dying off. A town that the people frequently would speak of. They'd lost their post office just a few years earlier. The only thing they had to speak of anymore in this town of just a couple hundred was a community center where they had line dancing on Friday night. That was the big event. And so we pulled up, and I knew something was different because we pulled up this little A-frame building, little white building that kind of set out in the bush country of West Texas. You know, no trees to speak of really around. So it kind of stood out there, and we pulled up, and it's a gravel parking lot, much like this one, but a whole lot dustier. And every single vehicle in the parking lot was a massive pickup truck. You know, the big ones, right? None of the small ones, just huge, massive pickup trucks. And so we pulled in with our 2005 Toyota Camry, you know, the only foreign car, I'm sure, in that parking lot. We pulled in and kind of nestled between two of the big trucks. We walked into the building. There's a bunch of guys standing in the back. And I don't want to describe too much how they looked, but they didn't look like me. They were dressed in different clothing. Cowboy boots, jeans, you know, you get the picture. And so I walk in, and one of them, I promise you, looked down, looked me up, looked down, looked me up, and said, well, I guess you're not going to need your place on the hat rack. And I turned around, and there is a hat rack. And one of the posts for the hats to go on said, preacher. And it was empty. And it stayed empty for a few months. So here we were, this group of 25 or so, West Texan, mostly farmers, people who work the land every day, some different kinds of people, mostly older people. I don't say old anymore, older people than me. their 60s, 70s, and 80s. There was a young family. They were in their 40s. That was the young people in the church. And I was their minister. And so you kind of, anytime you start a work like that, you're going through that period where you're trying to learn how to speak. And thankfully, in many ways, it wasn't totally foreign because I came from a family of farmers and politicians, but a family of farmers mostly, so I understood the farming world to an extent. I understood cotton, not what they did in West Texas, but I understood what it was like to, honestly speak about the weather and it be an important conversation. The fact that you're dependent on so many things outside your control, I understood that. I did a lot of preaching during those few months from Jesus' parables about the soil and the land because that spoke strongly to those people, and I wanted to make sure that I was speaking a language they understood. And so that's what we did. Slowly they began to welcome us as part of their community. This was a church that had no power. In fact, most people around there were telling them, you should really just close your doors. There's no reason for you to exist anymore. You can go to other churches where they're going to take care of you and you don't have to stretch your money just to make things work. And I have to admit, in many ways, that's what I was thinking. I'm just here basically to serve this purpose for a few months, but they're not going to survive. They're not going to last. By the end of the summer, so many of them began to really treat us like one of their own. One Sunday in particular, the oldest couple in the church, they were in their mid to late 80s. They'd been married something ridiculous, like 65 years. They said, we want to take you out. They knew I was from Mississippi, and so they wanted to take us out for catfish in a place close to there. And I found out close to West Texas means an hour drive. So we drove out an hour further away from Abilene, followed them in their old Oldsmobile car. They didn't bring their truck that week. And we followed them out to the catfish restaurant. And they began to talk about their marriage and all that they'd been through. And I'll never forget, they told me there's one important thing we've learned in our marriage. And I thought this is going to be good. I mean, these people have been married for 60 years. They're going to have some precious wisdom. And she looked us in the eyes, and I promise you, she pointed at each of us and said, have separate bank accounts. Hadn't heard that one before. We got in the car afterwards, and Rachel said, I don't care what the old people said, you're not getting your own bank account. But those sorts of conversations happened every week. We finally, we were invited to come and work with a church in Connecticut where we ended up spending 7 years. The young family in the church said, we're going to have everybody to our house to have a going away party. So they brought us up to their house. Come to find out, there hadn't been a lot of this going on in the last couple of decades in the church. So we had a big, you can only imagine it. The house was full of food and people were sitting everywhere. We're having this. And he gathered everybody in the room and said, now we're going to say goodbye to our minister today. And it struck me, they're calling me their minister. I showed up once a week. I preached probably very bad sermons. Probably didn't know what I was doing at all. But our minister. He said, they're moving to Connecticut. He says, I'm not real sure where that is. I think it's north of Kentucky. But we're going to send him, and he's going to go with our prayers and blessings. And they're going to go, and they're going to be our people, and we're sending them to do this ministry. And then they prayed over us. After that morning, or that afternoon, I was talking to a few of them, and they decided their ministry in the future was going to be to have young people come into that church and learn how to do ministry. I don't know what they're doing nowadays. I don't know if that church is open. I don't have any connections to that church anymore, really. But I do know that those people with no power, with no prestige, they were ranchers and farmers, some of them quite successful, but they were very hidden from most of the upper elite of society. God did mighty things through them. And you hear Jesus, and he looks at this widow, this woman who has nothing, and he says, she's the one you need to emulate. Because she's the one that knows how to minister. She's the one to know how to give up everything she had to make a difference. And we begin to think of our own lives. And to think, who am I? What do I have to offer? What do I have to give? What difference can I make? I work on a college campus, and as I was sharing this morning, we have a lot of students that come from a lot of different backgrounds. Some of them come from churches of Christ. Many of them do not. Some of them come from other religious backgrounds where they've been raised by parents who love God, parents who want to see them grow in their faith. We have a lot of that. We also have a lot of college students that come who don't know anything about God. And what little they know is very distorted and very different than what you could imagine. We have all of it. But one of the things that I constantly hear, both from the current generation and the generation that's kind of moving out of the college age now, is that many of them, they're open to the idea of being, they use this phrase, and you've probably heard it before, because it's not just young people that use it. I want to be spiritual but not religious. It's a very common phrase. Actually, we hear it when research is performed on where people are currently in North America. That's a phrase that you will hear. They might not directly say that, but that's what they imply. And I have to admit, in many ways, I have sympathy, I have empathy for that. Because what they're talking about is what Jesus has to point out in these scribes. They've seen the worst of what religious people do. They've watched their own parents or friends be ostracized because they didn't fit some paradigm. They've watched really bad situations happen to people around them, and religious people in the wrong, but with the power and the authority, have done things to people that they just can't stomach. They can't fathom why people would act that way, let alone people that claim to be religious. And so these college students come to us, and they're broken. Some of them will tell you heart-wrenching stories of what happened in the churches they grew up in. And they will look me in the eyes, sometimes in tears, and say, I don't want to be a part of that. But what Jesus would say as well is, I don't either. That's not what I came to do. I'd come to be a part of these scribes who just put on these long robes and look the part. I want to be the part. And Jesus here, he doesn't really, in other places, he doesn't speak wrongly of having power. Now, Jesus will say this, you better watch out. The more power you have, you better be more careful. But what he does have to say here is there's nothing wrong with the power, but it's the point that they love the power. They don't love the ability that it gives them to serve. And so Jesus points to these scribes. He says, you need to be different. And so many times we need to remind each other, we need to be different. We're not religious for the sake of being religious. And you can use that word or not use that word. I don't really care. But what I'd really love to do is reimagine that word in the way Jesus does. To imagine that the heart of religion is not some comfort. It's not a place of where we've gained this prestige and power, but it's a place where we become like one who has nothing to give. Because that's exactly what Jesus does. Some people read this text, scholars, and they look at it and they say, actually, Jesus he's not applauding the fact that the woman's giving all that she has, because she's giving it to this temple that's corrupt. In fact, in the very next few verses, if you look ahead, Jesus says, not one of these stones is going to be left here. And so some people read this text and say, actually, Jesus isn't saying, great that she's giving. He's actually saying, look at this humble servant who's being abused. To give to something that's not important. I don't know. Ultimately, for what I want to say this morning, I don't think it matters a whole lot. Because many times what we have the tendency to do is we have the tendency to create systems that reward the scribes and not the widow. And if there's anything that goes against what Jesus and what God has said from the beginning, it's that. Because from the very beginning, Jesus has pointed out those that don't have the power, those that have been pushed aside, those that have been ostracized, that's where I'll be. Because they understand what it means not to have and to need God. And again, Jesus flips everything upside down. Because that's not intuitively what we feel a lot of times. When we moved to Connecticut, our very first Sunday there, they threw us a big, get-together after church. We had a meal and everything. It was not like anything I'd ever known before. My wife grew up in Pennsylvania, for those that weren't in class, so she's from the Northeast, but neither one of us had spent a whole lot of time in New England. And I'll just say it's a very unique culture. And I can remember one of the older members pulling me inside who was from Oklahoma and said, today's going to be a first for you. And I said, okay. He said, you're going to go to a potluck dinner at a church and there will not be a single piece of fried chicken there. And he wasn't lying. I'd never been to one that didn't have it, and I would never go to one in Connecticut that had it. So it was different. This one gentleman, an African-American guy, looked about the age of my father, came walking up to me that first Sunday and said, Sam, my name is Dempsey. I said, hi, Dempsey, I'm Sam. He said, we're going to be best friends. Because you and I are both from Mississippi, and these people just aren't going to understand us. What I didn't realize is that Dempsey was being truthful. He really intended to be my best friend. What you have to understand about Dempsey is Dempsey, though he was from Mississippi and his family was from Mississippi, had mostly grown up in Connecticut. Dempsey never progressed much further than middle school. He had significant learning disabilities. He also had significant health issues, physical health issues. And in fact, Dempsey had to go through a lot of different surgeries and a lot of different work on his body to try to fix things. And one of the operations, there was some complications, and he had some bad blood work done, and it actually infected him with HIV. And so by the time I knew Dempsey, he was essentially dying. His body was breaking down. He'd never been a healthy guy. It's hard enough to fight off such a ravaging disease when you're healthy. It's almost impossible when you were in the situation Dempsey was in. Dempsey lived in Hartford, Connecticut. The church I worked with was just north of Hartford. Dempsey lived in one of the most dangerous zip codes east of the Mississippi. Just around the corner were some of the big tourist locations in the city of Hartford, the Mark Twain house. Mark Twain had spent most of his time there as an adult, and writing. His house had become a museum. There was a couple other museums down there, but right around the corner, not even hardly a block away, were some projects. Dempsey lived there. When Dempsey was growing up, his dad, who owned a business, had taken care of him. But after Dempsey's dad had passed away, there really wasn't anybody to take care of him, so Dempsey lived at the mercy of the state. And Dempsey lived in government-supported housing. Dempsey had found out about our church because he had been in a nursing facility after he was recouping from one of his surgeries, and it ended up coming to our congregation before I arrived. And Dempsey could not read. He could not write. He did not have the intellect that you would expect out of some great, magnificent person. He was a very simple person. He saw the world in very simple ways, but Dempsey loved people, and he intended for me to be his best friend. But Dempsey could remember names and numbers, so he would call you day and night. Dempsey lived in this house, this apartment, in downtown Hartford. He would call me to take him to his many hospital appointments at St. Francis, a huge hospital just down the road. He would call me to tell me it was a very weird thing, this African-American man in New England, in urban New England. He loved to watch Westerns, and so he'd talk about John Wayne and tell me what movie he had just watched. And he would just call just to shoot the breeze all the time. I would take Dempsey to the hospital, his many appointments. And one thing I began to notice with Dempsey is he walked down the halls of the hospital, everybody knew him. So like the guy cleaning the floor would scream out, "How's it going, Dempsey?" And then one day there was a guy that came walking by in obviously a nice suit and said, "Dempsey, how's it going?" I said, "Dempsey, who is that?" I mean, this guy was dressed, nicely. And Dempsey said, "Oh, I think he runs the place." He did. He was the CEO of the largest hospital in Connecticut. He knew Dempsey's name. Everybody knew Dempsey. Dempsey called everybody all the time. He was probably calling the people at the hospital as much as he was calling the people at the church. A couple of years before we left, Dempsey got really sick. He got put on hospice. Spent quite a few hours over with him, as well as some of the other people at church. And we just began to talk and about life. He would tell me stories, and he actually would want me to just come by and talk about Mississippi. He didn't remember it real well, but he just found this connection if I told him stories about his home state. Eventually he passed away. Dempsey was the only one in his family that came to our church. He had a sister and some other family that went to another church. And the minister, it was a Methodist church, called me and said, "Hey, I want to co-do the funeral with you since Dempsey went to your church." So the day of the funeral, a room about this size, I show up 20 minutes early and it's already packed. And this is one of those funeral homes that's not one of the updated new ones, that have like a separate space where they can put an overflow crowd and put things up on the screen and all that. They couldn't do that. So there were literally people looking inside the window. Hundreds of people packed into the room. I want you to remember, this is a black man from urban Connecticut who can't read and write, who has one of the largest funerals that I've ever participated in. And one of the things that the family wanted to do was open mic time. I hate open mic time at funerals. I love to hear from people, but it's just one of those things where you can't predict what people are going to say. And there was a stage area about half the size of this one. And we're going to do open mic time, and I'm just praying, please God, let this go well. Please don't let anybody get out of hand and all of that. So we do, come and share. And the other minister and I are sitting up in a couple chairs. And one after one, people start coming up. This goes for like an hour. And they would get finished talking about Dempsey and all that he meant to them. Again, think of who this is. And they're just crowding up on the stage, and I can barely see around, and I'm wondering when this is going to end, because things are going well, but, I'm a little cynical that it's going to continue to go well, and I just want to shut this down. And finally, this lady, this tall, large lady, comes up. She gets up, and I look around the room, and you get that look like, you don't have to know her, and I didn't, but you can tell nobody wants her up there because they're worried. You know that look. And so she comes up, and she kind of takes hold of the podium, and I promise you the very first thing she says is, "Most of you don't even want me here today." Now at this point, this is getting good. So I'm looking around, and I'm like, all right, what is going on? She says, "Most of you hate me. Most of you can't stand me. Because we've had issues." She doesn't get into any of that, and it would have been entertaining if she gotten into some of that, but she doesn't get into that, and everybody actually hear an amen from the back of the room. She says, "Dempsey every single week called me. And probably like most of you, I got tired of him calling. And at that point, there's a huge amen in the room. But every week he called me, and he told me what you people were doing. My family. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want anything to do with it. Because there's been a lot of bad blood in this family." She goes, "But Dempsey kept it together. I'm here today because of Dempsey. I drove from Detroit, where most of Dempsey's other family lived. I came here today to be at this funeral because of Dempsey. And that's why I'm standing up here." And I told our church that next Sunday morning, that might be the most important member of this congregation that we've ever had. And I hate to use that phrasing, but they knew what I meant. He represented what it meant to serve God whenever he could. He had no power. He had no skills to speak of in terms of impressive public persona. He was a humble servant. Jesus sees the widow, and he says, "You be like her. Look at the one who's coming for you, because we serve a God who revels in those without inherent power." This is when God does his best work. The text that we looked at in class this morning says, Christ himself apportioned us with gifts. The reason we are who we are is because God chose us to be that way. And what God asks us to do in return is to be like this poor widow and to give everything we have for the sake of others. To be willing to look around us and say, "I will serve you. I will give my very last penny for the sake of the gospel." Because the God I serve can do a whole lot with it. And that's what God calls us to. I get the opportunity now to visit a lot of different churches, to visit a lot of different, go and speak at youth rallies and things like that. We were at a youth rally just back in August in western Kansas. I'd never really spent much time in western Kansas. That is the middle of nowhere. There's a lot of people that God is working through mightily. It doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter where you travel. You will find God working through people that will impress you. And it's not because they're eloquent speakers. It's not always because they have a lot of money and prestige and power. And God bless those people who are willing to give over so much of what they have for the sake of the gospel. But what Jesus has to say to us today in this, and what he has to say here, is that look at this widow. Notice the way that she doesn't question that she doesn't have enough. Notice the way she doesn't question, well, God hasn't blessed me with enough. But she's willing to give what she has. And when we have courage to be like that, the blessings of God are not about money, and not always about health, and not always about everything working out okay, but it's the fact that God's work is being done. What a wonderful opening this morning. The story of this church being told in a few short sentences. That God has made it possible. And Jesus looks at this widow and says, there are going to be things that God can do in this world that are unspeakable to most of you. But a lot of it will be done through widows just like this. People that realize that it's not about me, but it's about the one who works through me. That's what God has called us through. God has gifted you uniquely. He has made you who you are. Whether you have a lot or you have a little. Whether you're extremely talented or you can't see your talent any day of the week. God has blessed you with opportunities to walk and to serve. And here's what's so amazing about what the widow does. It's not impressive. Right? The act itself does not require her to be talented. For all I know, she's pushing her stroller up in there, or somebody's rolling her in a wheelchair. It's the fact that what she has is she's willing to give up for the sake of what God is doing through her. And God does the same through us. So we hear the call of God, right? We hear the God who calls us and says, here's your... There is always the opportunity to serve God. No matter what circumstance we find ourselves in, no matter what our background is, or no matter what direction we're headed, we always will have the opportunity to serve God. It's just a matter of whether we're willing to do it or not. To give what we have and to make a difference. God will bless it. God will use you. And God will bless your efforts if you're willing to give. If you want to come to God, come this morning as we stand and sing.